The EU is arguably the largest unification project in European history. More and more states want to join it, and in the coming years, it is likely that additional countries from Eastern Europe and the Balkans will also join the Union. However, to this day, there is a small white spot in the midst of the EU, a state that vehemently refuses to join the alliance: Switzerland. Politically, economically, and culturally, the Alpine country would actually fit perfectly into the European Union, and even EU politicians were firmly convinced that Switzerland would eventually join the club, which is why they agreed to a Swiss special path. However, the Alpine country has no intention of doing so, but rather continues to distance itself from the EU. Neutrality arguments are repeatedly mentioned, but Austria's neutrality policy did not prevent it from joining. What makes Swiss neutrality so different? And what are the real reasons behind Switzerland's strong refusal to become part of the European Union? What role does the country's past play, and how does Switzerland secretly benefit from its special status? We will explore all these fascinating questions in today's video. Enjoy! We first need to understand the Swiss mindset, which is based on the pillars of a freedom-loving and self-determined people. The roots of this are particularly evident in history. Since the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, Switzerland has followed a completely different path than its neighboring states and most other European countries. Switzerland declared itself strictly neutral and independent from the instructions of other states after painful experiences in past wars. This declaration was already a maneuver and a play of the various great powers. It was not that Switzerland was not threatened from the outside. Both France and Austria would have liked to control Switzerland as a satellite state, and Prussia wanted to integrate Switzerland into the German Confederation. The establishment of a kingdom in Switzerland was even discussed. However, Switzerland managed to skillfully play off states against each other in diplomatic negotiations, so no agreement was reached. It seemed best for everyone to agree on a compromise. The states then guaranteed to fully respect Switzerland's inviolability and independence within the boundaries established in 1815. In return, Switzerland committed to remaining neutral in all future conflicts. A rather clever move. A similar pattern can be seen in other conflicts over the last 200 years, such as the maneuvering between Allies and Axis powers in the two world wars to ensure survival. Since Switzerland was not directly involved in any wars in recent centuries and always pursued its own independent policy, a different understanding has developed there. The result is the rather unusual political system of Switzerland, in which direct democracy plays a central role. This is quite unique in Europe, but reflects the strong independence mindset of the population. In the Alpine country, while legislative representatives are elected, the final say on legislation rests with the residents of Switzerland through referendums. In contrast to Germany, where representatives to the Bundestag are elected every 4 years, but the population has little influence during the legislative period, the Swiss can constantly influence politics, and it is always very careful to get the best for itself. This was evident in various negotiations with the EU and its predecessor organizations. It is not that Switzerland was uninterested in relations with the European Community of States. In 1960, it participated in the founding of the European Free Trade Association, FTA. In 1972, a bilateral free trade agreement was concluded with the states of the European Economic Community and the European Coal and Steel Community, and further trade barriers were removed. In 1999, a comprehensive package of bilateral agreements followed, including free air and land traffic, Switzerland's participation in European research programs and agriculture, as well as the further removal of technical trade barriers. But as we see, all these agreements are primarily of an economic nature. All attempts by the EU to politically integrate Switzerland met with immediate rejection. In several referendums, the population clearly voted against joining the Union. Nevertheless, in recent years, there seemed to be a slight rapprochement. Starting in 2018, negotiations began on an institutional framework agreement to redefine the relationship between Switzerland and the EU. However, these were eventually abandoned by Switzerland in 2021. This happened after years of discussions and increasing resistance within the country, especially concerning the adoption of EU law and the potential restriction of Swiss sovereignty. So what are the reasons for the strong rejection of the EU? Switzerland is too rich and too stable to want to join the EU, argued Fabio Wasserfallen, professor of European politics at the University of Bern. For the Swiss, the EU offers little advantage. As we know, Switzerland is one of the richest countries in Europe, which would naturally make it a net contributor to the Union. This means it would have to pay in much more than it would receive. Additionally, many fear that this could lead to a decrease in the high wages in Switzerland, and other reasons that provided incentives for other states to join are not applicable to the Alpine country. Many Eastern and Southern European states hoped for political stability, which has long been present in Switzerland. And Switzerland is also in a relatively stable security and geopolitical situation. I have already mentioned the economic factors. Added to this is the very important high finance and banking industry for Switzerland. With few regulations and bureaucracy, it offers great incentives for these companies to establish themselves. This would surely change after joining the EU. Despite numerous bilateral economic agreements, Switzerland stubbornly clings to its banking secrecy, which is strongly criticized in the EU. Another industry with an exceptional role is agriculture. The Alpine country has one of the highest subsidy rates for its agriculture worldwide. This financial support helps farmers remain competitive in a country with high production costs. Additionally, there are protective measures such as tariffs on certain imported agricultural products to protect domestic agriculture from international competition. Swiss agricultural policy and the practice of local subsidies could be affected by EU regulations. The EU has strict rules and subsidy guidelines that might clash with Switzerland's preferences for local agriculture and subsidies. And then there is the central political reason. We have already talked about direct democracy, which is deeply ingrained in the Swiss understanding. Many fear that the EU would pose a threat to this cherished principle. Membership in the EU would mean that Switzerland would have to apply EU law, which often takes precedence over national law. This could significantly restrict the Swiss people's ability to directly influence legislation through referendums. Potential conflicts could arise in areas such as immigration policy, agriculture, or labor legislation. We are also dealing with another point: the relatively aimless asylum and immigration policy of the EU states, where compromises were long absent, was met with rejection in Switzerland. Switzerland places great importance on the ability to set and control its own immigration rules. For example, in 2014, the Swiss voted in a referendum for the introduction of immigration quotas for citizens from EU countries, which contradicted the freedom of movement agreements with the EU. And even for immigration from third countries, there are fixed regulations. Thus, Switzerland continues to pursue the clear model of bilateral agreements tailored to it instead of EU membership. This means it can choose the areas in which it collaborates with EU states, but also reject cooperation in other areas. It is not obligated to implement laws from Brussels and can thus conduct its own policy. For many EU politicians, this is a thorn in the side, and Switzerland is repeatedly accused of cherry-picking. Although there are voices from Switzerland suggesting that membership could offer more benefits from the EU single market, like Germany, in reality, there are few reasons for Switzerland to change its stance. Thus, a deeper integration or even full membership in the Union remains quite unlikely. Switzerland enjoys great international respect due to its independent stance. It is repeatedly used as a mediator in conflicts and is seen by almost all countries of the world as a safe and reliable partner in global affairs.